Okay. So good morning. My name is Heather Crow. I'm a borehole geophysicist at the Geological Survey of Canada. And this morning I'm happy to be talking to you about our experience over the last 5 or 6 years testing, evaluating, and running relatively new geophysical logging tools that measure porosity continuously along the borehole wall. And before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank my collaborators in this, the Morwick G360 Groundwater Research Institute at the University of Guelph, my colleagues at the GSC, and also contributions this morning from the University of Waterloo. So first I'll be talking about what is nuclear magnetic resonance logging. It's quite a mouthful, so we just call it NMR. I'll talk a little bit about the study that we carried out to evaluate this tool in Ontario. I'll present 4 different examples of the data collected in rock and sediment settings in southern Ontario in our calibration boreholes. I'll talk at the end a little bit about some ongoing research that we're carrying on with the tool, and I'll close off with some resources on how you could implement this technology into your own projects. So what is NMR? Well, you can think of it as using the physics of medical MRI or imaging technology that we're all more or less familiar with and condensing it down into a groundwater logging tool or a downhole geophysical logging tool that continuously measures porosity along the borehole wall. And it does this using magnets in the logging tool that polarize the hydrogen that we find in the groundwater in the pores around the borehole. So what are the advantages of using this technology? Well, right off the top, I can say it fits in the size of boreholes that we drill for our hydrogeological investigations. This technology is very mature in the oil and gas industry. They've been using these tools now for over 5 decades, but the tools they use are very large diameter, they're very long, they're very heavy, they're very expensive, and it just wouldn't be feasible or economic to use those logging tools in our hydrogeological scaled boreholes. So this technology has been downscaled over the last decade, and now we can use them in boreholes as small as 2-inch PVC. This tool, as it's shown here, some of the models of this tool also have multiple diameters of investigation, and this is particularly useful if you're logging sediment boreholes because you can look beyond the disturbed zone, the completion, the sandpack, or the grout that's in the borehole. And finally, I think really important to all of us is that these tools measure porosity without requiring radioactive sources. So it's a little bit safer from a hydrogeological perspective. We're not having to integrate density or neutron tools, but we can still achieve a similar level of detail. Now, I think maybe also most important to us in the hydrogeological world is that this tool provides us with needed aquifer parameters. So not only does it provide us with total porosity or volumetric water content, but it also provides us with a discernment of the different styles of porosity that we find in the material we're logging. So here's an example here of a theoretical geological material. It contains water bound in tiny clay-sized pores. It has water bound in pore throats. These two are considered by us the bound water fraction. And then it has mobile water in larger pores, which we'd consider the water that's able to move through the formation and contributes to the effective porosity. So this tool allows us to discern between different types of porosity, and you'll see in the coming slides that I've color-coded all of the different fractions of water with clay-bound water in brown, capillary water in light blue, and mobile or effective porosity in dark blue. And so the way hydrogen protons relax in these alternating magnetic fields that the tool creates are all different and depend on the fraction of porosity that the water resides in. And so the tool characterizes this by producing what we call a T2 distribution, and the T here just means time. So the clay-bound water relaxes much more quickly than the larger pores or the mobile water in the larger fraction. And so at each measurement point along the borehole wall, the tool combines what we call a T2 distribution. Now, having that information, the distribution of pore sizes and also the total water content, allows us to calculate hydraulic conductivity using a variety of different models that are developed and some constants for that type of material. So what are the limitations with this tool? Because there always are some. This is an example or a photo of the GSC's NMR logging tool. Well, this tool creates very strong magnetic fields, and so as a result, it does not work inside metal casings, unfortunately. It will work within PVC, and it will work below metal casings. So you can slide through the surface metal casing, get down into the deeper part of the borehole, it will still work. Now, because of this sensitivity to magnetic fields, the tool will not work in rocks that are extremely magnetic. And it's also somewhat sensitive to rock that does contain a little bit of magnetic material. So this is important to us in southern Ontario because we live on the fringes of the Laurentide ice sheet. And so some of the sediment that has come to southern Ontario does contain some Precambrian materials. And so you'll see in this little micro photograph of some sediment near Ottawa, I've circled the iron oxide here. This is a tiny magnetite silt-sized grain. And so the tool will work fine in these types of settings where we have small amounts of magnetite in the sediment. We can work around it, but we do need to know that it exists. And finally, this tool moves very slowly. So if you're used to geophysical tools that are run very quickly up and down the borehole, this one operates at a much slower rate because we need to move slowly and stack the data. We're measuring a very tiny signal in the ground, and so we need to be able to move the tool fairly slowly in order to collect high-quality data. So we partnered with the University of Guelph, the Morwick G360 group, and we carried out an evaluation for a number of years at our respective borehole bedrock calibration sites, both in Ottawa and in Guelph. And we examined a number of things with how the tool performs. So we looked at the tool response function to assess how does it sense the ground as the tool is moving through the rock or sediment. We looked at how repeatable is the tool over a period of hours to days and found that the tool was indeed very stable, extremely repeatable. We looked at the effects of fractures on the tool response. How large does a fracture need to be in the wall in order for us to detect it as a discrete feature? We also looked at the effects of parameter selection, things like how quickly should we move the tool or should we keep the tool stable? How many times do we need to stack the data in order to achieve high-quality data sets? And finally, we compared the core porosities and other geophysical logs to the NMR log responses. So I'll be talking about that a little bit in the coming slides. Let's look at some data. So this is our first field site. This is an esker aquifer, so a sediment site just outside Ottawa, Ontario, where the local community draws their groundwater from this buried esker. So this is the porosity log from the NMR tool. The upper 15 meters are a mud of the Champlain Sea, so these are very fine-grained silts and clay sediments. And you can see that, and they're also very high in water content. So you can see that the tool correctly interprets that this is primarily clay-bound water in the upper 15 meters, forming an aquifer. And below that, we get down into the sediment of the aquifer, and the tool correctly identifies that this porosity is primarily mobile water. Now, at this site, we also experimented with how the tool computes, or how we can compute hydraulic conductivity with the instrument, because we had a set of calibration data from some packer testing that was done in the esker. And by experimenting with and developing different constants and using the distribution of pore sizes that the tool interpreted for us, we were closely able to match the tool's hydraulic conductivity, what we'd call KNMR, to the hydraulic conductivity computed from the packer test data. Before I move on, I just want to point out in the upper around 10 meters or so, you're going to see some mobile water in the mud. And that is unusual. That really shouldn't be there. If we have clay-bound water, we shouldn't be seeing mobile water within it. And that's a result of a drilling disturbance around the borehole wall. These are sensitive geotechnical clays, and there was sort of an enlargement in the borehole wall behind the casing. And so we picked up some disturbance from the drilling there. And so we can overcome these sorts of challenges with a different type of instrument, an NMR instrument that's on the end of a push tool. So this is an experiment that we carried out with that the University of Waterloo carried out as part of a public demonstration that was carried out between the tool manufacturer, the GSC, and the Morowitchi 360 group, all gathered at the North Campus Research Site here on the campus of the University of Waterloo, and pushed an NMR tool into sediment at the North Campus Research Site. You can see this log here shown alongside or in the context of sediment interpreted from an adjacent borehole. So the outermost black line represents the porosity that was interpreted in that sediment, and the inner red line that's a little bit lower shows the mobile water fraction within that total water content. So you can see there are some intervals where we see much higher mobile water at the base of a silt layer there, where there probably is a sand seam that was not detected by the sampling, the core sampling, and then again at the base of the hole in the sandier layers. We'll switch now to a bedrock site. This is here in Ottawa. This is at our borehole calibration test site, where we've collected a number of different porosity runs up and down this borehole wall. We'll just zoom in on a subsection here in the upper 30 meters. So the first column is the stratigraphy with a gamma log, and then next to that we have two optical televiewer logs. These are 360-degree unwrapped images of the inside of the borehole wall. So the first one is a color digital image, and the second one is an ultrasonic image or an acoustic televiewer image that measures the shape and sort of form of the inside of the borehole. So where we see yellow, we have high reflectivity. This is a dense, low porosity rock. And where we have the orange and red tones, we see that this is sort of a bumpier borehole wall, likely as a result of being more porous. And that's exactly what the NMR log is showing us, is that this Nepean sandstone is actually variably porous along its length. It's sort of uniformly colored. We didn't have this perspective on how variable the porosity, matrix porosity could be until we were able to deploy this tool. And we compared some of the core porosity measurements that we made here, which I've just laid over top, and found that the agreement was very good, within about 4 porosity units on average between core porosity and NMR porosity. So this gives us information about the matrix. This is really important information if you're looking at diffusion of contaminants to really understand the porosity as opposed to just the fracture flow system. However, we can pull that information in. So this set of logs just gives us more information about how water is flowing through the borehole within the fractured rock. So we have a caliper log. I've introduced some flow meter logs to tell us where water is changing or flow is changing in the well. And also we can include some fluid logging data, either temperature or conductivity, to give us more information about where water is flowing through fractures and out into the well. So the NMR log as a whole has given us a broader perspective for hydrogeological studies on how water is moving through the rock, not just through fracture, but also through the matrix. Our final example comes from this area, the Guelph Dolostone. This is a bedrock borehole at MG360's Fractured Rock Observatory, which is a cluster of 10 boreholes at the University Arboretum. On the far left-hand side here is a stratigraphic column. The colors in brown tones have more fine grain content. And you can see by the gamma log, the gamma counts are higher here. When we get down into the lower part of the well, the blue tones, this is the gas port formation. And so the rock here is a little bit less fractured, but the VUG counts are much, much higher in this interval of the rock. And so the NMR log is shown at the final sort of outer right side here. In the upper portion of the hole where the porosity is finer, there is more fine grain content. The core measurements, which are shown as these black boxes here overlying the NMR log, achieve really good agreement with the NMR log. But as we get down into the VUGs, you can see that the core measurements are starting to disagree a little bit with the NMR log. Now, the core measurements are made on small pucks. They are necessarily chosen in intervals where the rock is not fractured, where there's fewer VUGs, so that we can actually get the sample in the apparatus to test. And so if we look at, so there is an issue of scale mismatch here, that the NMR tool is looking out over a larger volume of the rock. It's looking further out into the formation, and it's able to integrate the presence of these VUGs into the measurement. So if we look at this in a slightly different way on a cross plot where we have core porosity on X and NMR porosity on Y, we can see that the plots are quite good. The agreement between the finer grained porosity is quite high here, but once we get out into the vuggier rock with vugs that are sort of on the order of a centimeter, the NMR tool is giving us a new perspective on just how much free water is present in this aquifer. So as part of our study, I'm just going to close out with a couple of slides on the research, the direction that we're taking this research now, because we realized that in order to calibrate the NMR tool, we really needed something to compare with, as opposed to just little discrete core pucks. We needed something a bit more continuous along the borehole, or along the core. So a colleague of ours at GSC in Quebec City has developed a technique to scan cores with a CT scanner, a medical CT scanner. So this is an example of the Guelph dolostone cut right through the center of the core. So this is a cross-section of the core where the black dots represent pore space and the gray intervals represent the matrix of the core. And this allows us to measure total porosity continuously along the core surface. So if you just look at the image on the left-hand side here, this is on the far left is a photograph of the core, and then next to it is a cross-section through the core. And on the left-hand side, or on the right-hand side, is an overlay of all the different types of porosity that have been measured. So the black line represents the core porosity continuously measured along the core at sub-millimeter intervals. And the underlying colors represent the NMR measurement that was taken downhole. And so now we have continuous measurements between the NMR along the borehole wall and the CT scan porosity. I've also laid in there a scale of the core plug so that you get a sense of when we're comparing NMR to core plugs, we have a little bit of a scale mismatch. But now that we have the CT scan data, we're really going to be able to evaluate in a continuous way how the NMR interprets porosity. Now, as a final note here, this revolving image is another product that we've been able to calculate from the CT scan data. This is where the cores have not only been scanned dry, but scanned a second time saturated. And so by subtracting the two images, the dry and the wet CT scans, we're able to see where water has filled the pore space. And so this gives us an impression of how water is moving through this Guelph dolostone. It's an incredible visual way to look at how water is moving through bedrock cores or through porous cores, and is going to help us interpret how the NMR interprets permeability, because at this point it's just an equation. And so this gives us some perspective on how realistic is the NMR permeability calculation. Okay, so if I convinced you that this is technology that you think would be useful to integrate into your practice or into your projects, we've written up all of this experience that we've taken both in using NMR in fractured bedrock aquifers and also in sediment aquifers in southern Ontario. And we are happy to share this information with you. We'd enjoy discussing it with you. So these resources are available, and you can either email me or download these resources for free online. Now also, if you are interested in borehole geophysics and some of the techniques that I've been talking about this morning, there's an excellent free resource that has been published in the last year. This is through John Cherry's groundwater project. There's about 50 different ebooks that are available online. One of them is dedicated to borehole geophysical logging for hydrogeological studies, and I highly recommend it. It's excellent and it's free. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions and chat over the breaks. Thank you.